Good evening. My name is Sergio Gonzalez Barella, and I am a member of the Change Student Organization for the Rutland Institute for Ethics. It is a pleasure to be here this evening with such a dynamic group of professionals and Clemson students. Tonight promises to be memorable, so we welcome you to participate in the discussion and learn as much as possible. We are thankful that each of you took the time to be with us, some in person and some virtually. The Change Student Ethics Organization is proud to be an intricate part of the programming for not only Annual Ethics Day, but for other programming in each of the colleges on Clemson University's campus. Consider joining our unique organization, an organization that impacts every college on campus and every student on campus. We make a difference, and we look forward to your help in integrating ethics throughout all that we do. At this time, let's welcome to the podium Rachel Dial, the Assistant Director for the Rutland Institute for Ethics.
Good evening, everyone. The Rutland Institute for Ethics is proud to celebrate 20 years of helping Clemson Tigers to exercise ethical decision-making and ethical leadership in the face of ethical dilemmas. The true success of the Rutland Institute lies in the power of our students, our faculty, and our board members. Our student group, Change, Creating Habits and Norms Guiding Ethical Decisions, develops programming that challenges the entire student body to think about ethics in everyday situations. Our faculty group, Faculty Advocating for the Committee to Ethics, FACE, oversees opportunities to integrate ethics education into the university's curriculum. And our board provides time, talent, treasure, and advice from a business professional perspective to encourage the graduation of ethical leaders. A number of these constituents are attending the session virtually, but I would ask any Rutland board members, FACE members, and Change members to please stand and be recognized at this time. There's a couple. Yeah. Thank you. The Rutland Institute for Ethics has a history of engaging some of the best and most knowledgeable speakers within their disciplines, and this evening is no exception. Tonight, our moderator will be Dr. Jill Shelnut, a faculty member in the College of Education, who helped to promote our keynote speaker. Let's welcome Dr. Shelnut.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Jill Shelnut, and I serve on the Faculty Ethics Committee for the board for Rutland, as well as a professor in the College of Education. It's exciting to have with us one of the foremost educators of our time. Dr. Kevin Kumashiro is an internationally recognized expert on educational policy, school reform, thank you, teacher preparation, and educational equity and social justice, with a wide-ranging list of accomplishments and awards as a scholar, educator, leader, and advocate. He is the former dean of the School of Education at the University of San Francisco and is the award-winning author or editor of 10 books, including Against Common Sense, Teaching and Learning Towards Social Justice, and most recently, Surrendered, Why Progressives Are Losing the Biggest Battles in Education. His recent awards include the 2016 Social Justice in Education Award from the American Educational Research Association, an honorary doctorate of humane letters. It is indeed a pleasure to have Dr. Kumashiro with the Clemson family this evening to share with us how to deal with the controversial issues and ethical dilemmas embedded in the field of education. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our annual Ethics Day keynote speaker, Dr. Kevin Kumashiro.
Thank you so much. What a treat to be able to join all of you at Clemson University. I'm sorry I'm not able to be there in person, but I'm thrilled to be there in spirit. And so thank you to Clemson University and especially the Rutland Institute for Ethics and your amazing director, Dr. William McCoy. Thanks to my colleagues on stage, Sergio Gonzalez Varela, Rachel Dial, and Dr. Jill Shelnut, the Institute staff, the event organizers and sponsors, College of Education, and the Dean, George Peterson, and all of you for joining today. I'm joining you from the San Francisco Bay Area, the unceded lands of the Ohlone and other indigenous nations and tribes, and I wish to honor the original stewards of these lands, as well as to express my solidarity with ongoing struggles for decolonization, sovereignty, and justice. So I wanted to talk today about why should I care, or why should we care, and how do we address ethical dilemmas and controversial issues in and through education. And the way I'd like to do that, well, actually, let me just sort of step back and reflect a little bit. I was thinking about this last night, like these questions of why should I care, and what does it mean to engage in ethical decision-making? I think it's important to think about how, particularly within the field of education, this calls on us to think not only in the abstract and in general terms, but also in very specific, situated, context-specific terms. In other words, what does it mean for us to really dive deeply into understanding the moment that we find ourselves in, and understanding what is it about this moment that calls on me to intervene, and to intervene in specific ways. So this is sort of how I want to talk about this larger topic of the role of education, and what does it mean for us to be involved in and through education in addressing controversial issues in larger society. So I'm going to draw on some of my research in public schools. I'm also going to draw on some of my administrative experiences in higher education and my work in leadership to try to reflect on these questions. And I'm going to do that by talking about what I call 5 lenses, or 5 concepts that I've found particularly helpful for thinking about, how do we engage in education in ways that advance democracy and that can address controversy. So just a little bit of description. Why do I say 5 lenses, like eyeglasses, and 5 lenses? So I like to tell the story of how, I don't know how it was where all of you were growing up, but where I was growing up, sometimes if you were dating someone, you might have had, the two of you might have had our song. Am I right? It's a song that had special meaning because maybe it was the first song you had dinner to, or the first song that you danced to. And every time you hear that song on the radio, you both go, oh, until you break up with that person. And then, am I right? You don't want to hear that song anymore. So that to me is a perfect example of how our life experiences are always creating new and unique lenses that we look through to make sense of the world around us. These are lenses that are colored by our childhood upbringing, our cultural background, our educational experiences, our professional training. It's why I can listen to the same song at different times in my life and respond differently. It's also why 2 people can watch the same movie or even listen to the same presentation and respond very differently. We're always looking through partial, ever-changing, unique lenses. So what I would argue is that the goal of education is not to require that we all look through the same lens. Part of the goal, or one of the major goals of education, is to build our capacity to examine the partiality, the gaps of any lens that we look through, right? The promises and the pitfalls of any way of making sense of the world. So part of what I want to do today is explore 5 such lenses, 5 ways of thinking about education, of thinking about ethics, of thinking about sort of the larger society, democracy, and see, does it help us to see the problems and the solutions with more complexity? Okay? So the first lens I want to talk about is what I call naming the moment and our intervention. Naming the moment and our intervention. So naming the moment, I was once at a conference. I grew up in Hawaii. I don't know if you can all hear my slight Hawaii accent, but I grew up in Hawaii, and I was once at a conference there a few years ago. And one of the keynote speakers said, with the rising sea levels, Hawaii might not really be much inhabitable within a matter of decades. Like, how is it that we continue to go on with business as usual in education, given this literally existential crisis? Now, what I believe she urges us to think about is how the specifics of the moment we find ourselves in call on us to act. And it is about the climate. It is also about the pandemic. It's also about attacks on democracy. It's also about rising unemployment, mental health crisis, privatization and profiteering, the widening wealth gap. All of these things define the moment. And I think we need to be asking, what does it mean for us to respond? And in particular, what does it mean to prepare the next generation of young people to navigate the context as it is being defined? This also makes me think about, as we think about the moment we're in, let's even think about the larger kind of society that we're building towards. I was once at another conference where one of the speakers said, we think of ourselves, the United States, as a democratic nation. And we think that our schools are also democratic. But what actually does it mean to be teaching towards democracy? What does it mean to be in a schooling and educational system that is supporting and advancing democracy? Like, think, for example, on the flip side of that question. Let's say you are in a totalitarian or very oppressive society. What would you imagine schooling in that society to look like? Like in a totalitarian or fascist society, what would we imagine schools would look like? I think many people would say, well, for the elite, schools might look really quite awesome. They might be really well-resourced, really rigorous, teaching you to be leaders, teaching you to be creative thinkers. But for the masses, the schools might be really quite different. They might be under-resourced. They might be teaching a watered-down curriculum. They might not be preparing you to lead. They might be preparing you to follow, and so on, right? You might be creating this sort of two-tiered schooling system is what we might imagine, where the masses are merely being taught to follow. Okay. Well, many people have argued over the last few decades that the US schooling system looks kind of like that the wealthy get a really good schooling system, the masses get an under-resourced schooling system. The curriculum looks quite different. What we're preparing people for looks quite different. In other words, in the United States, why is it that many would say that our schooling system looks like what we would expect in a very different kind of society? If we were to develop a schooling system that's trying to prepare people for democracy, what would that look like? What would schooling for democracy look like? So this is, I think, some of the questions that come up to me when I think about what it means to name the moment and to ask, what is our intervention in this moment? Some of you study education. One of the most well-known scholars in education is from Brazil. His name is Paulo Freire, who in the late 1960s wrote a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Pedagogy of the Oppressed. One of the arguments that Freire makes in this book is that we should not dive too quickly down a path to solve a problem until we first more deeply understand what that problem is. He calls this reading the world. We need to read the world. And I'm using the term name the moment. We need to, in other words, tell our own story about what the problem is. Because if we don't take the time to tell our own story, what we might end up doing is simply buying into someone else's story of what the problem is, which means that the solution we come up with might not make things any better. What is the story that we believe we should be telling about the moment we find ourselves in? And what then does that story call on us to do? This leads to the second lens that I wanted to talk about, which is what I'm calling questioning common sense. Questioning common sense. So common sense, what is common sense? We often think common sense is a good thing. Like, think about if you work with young children, many times when a young child is like not behaving well, what is something we often say to that child to get them to like behave better? We often say, stop that, like use your common sense, right? Like common sense is a good thing. So what I want to suggest is that common sense isn't always a helpful or positive thing. Let me give a couple of examples related to education that illustrates this idea. About 100 years ago in this country, in the United States, about 100 years ago, many people believed that girls should not get too much education. And like at around the late 1800s, early 1900s, girls actually weren't getting a lot of education. They either weren't going to school or they were maybe going up to around the 4th or 5th grade. Now, why did we say that? Well, some people believed that women belonged in the home, so they didn't need a lot of schooling. Some people believed that women would compete with men for jobs, so they shouldn't get too much schooling. But some of you are probably aware that about 100 years ago, there are many people who also believed in a science of the time that said something like this. The mind is connected to the body, and if you mess up one, you might mess up the other. So if girls got too much education, they might go crazy, they might become physically ill, or they might even become infertile. Like, you do too much homework and you can't have babies. Like, that seems like a strange thing to be saying now. But my point is that about 100 years ago, for many people, that was taken to be the conventional wisdom at the time. That was what many people considered the common sense of the time. Think about 50 years ago. About 50 years ago, many people believed that people with darker skin should not get too much education. And why did we say that? Well, some people believed that there would be competition for jobs, but there was also a so-called science of that time that was telling us something like this. People of darker skin do not have as much intellectual capacity. In other words, they're not as smart as people with lighter skin. So why should we waste our time and our resources teaching them? Now, today, many of us look back and we think, wow, what an incredibly racist thing to say. But my point is that about 50 years ago, for many people, and even for many people today, that went unquestioned. That was taken to be science. That was taken to be common sense. Now, I give these two examples not to make fun of people 50 or 100 years ago, but rather to raise the question, 50 years from now, how might we look back and say, I can't believe in the year 2021, it was commonsensical to think this. Like, what is the common sense of our time that is actually preventing us from seeing what's really going on? What are the commonsensical ideas that we're not even really questioning, right? Think, for example, about over the last few decades, what have been some of the commonsensical ideas that have shaped, I see a number of students are in the audience, that have shaped the experiences for students. Well, one of the commonsensical ideas that both Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals seem to buy into over the last few decades is the notion that testing will give us all the answers. And so we embarked on all sorts of kind of standards and testing, test and punish type of regime. This is called the standards and testing era of the United States educational system, which we're still in and have been in for the last 4 decades, right? Well, there's actually a lot of research that tells us that testing cannot possibly tell us everything we need to know, that in fact, relying on testing to make high stakes decisions is not only leading to problematic consequences, but there's actually no scientific basis to do that. And yet, we've insisted that that's what we should be doing. In fact, when we reopened schools this past academic year, or I should say in the spring of 2021, what did we as a nation do? We actually went back to insisting that states needed to do high stakes testing. Right? We insisted on returning to the use of testing in education. Now, this is in general something that we should be doing, questioning common sense. But I think it's particularly salient, particularly important when we think about moments of crisis. So some of you are on YouTube. If you go to a video on YouTube called Coronavirus Capitalism, you'll see one of my favorite writers and scholars and journalists, Naomi Klein. Naomi Klein is featured in this video called Coronavirus Capitalism. It was released last summer. And one of the things that she reminds us of is that how a society responds to a crisis depends on the stories available to us in that moment. Right? So if we all believe, for example, in the story that there isn't a lot of resources, scarcity, and that the way you respond is you cut spending, austerity, right? The scarcity and austerity stories have dominated so much that what we engage in is a debate on how much to cut rather than debating whether we should be cutting anything at all, right? Buying into only certain stories narrows our ability to imagine a different way forward. It restricts what we think of as the alternatives. And just as a side note, some of you study probably political science. What have many scholars like Marx, like Lenin, like Foucault, like Freire, what have many such scholars argued for decades is that while one way to control a population is through violence, force, and fear and threats, what is an even more effective way to control a population? It's to get everyone to buy into your story of what the world is supposed to look like so that they don't even question the reality in the first place, right? Stories matter. And the alternatives, our ability to offer alternatives is one of the ways that we can pivot towards a better future. The last point I'll make about this second lens on questioning common sense comes from another of my favorite writers, the Indian novelist Arundhati Roy. Arundhati Roy last year wrote an article called "The Pandemic is a Portal." The pandemic is a portal, is where she makes the argument that in a moment of crisis, like when the pandemic hit, everyone wanted to return to normalcy as quickly as possible. And her argument is that we shouldn't rush to return to normal, because sometimes when we rush to return to normal, we double down on some of the worst aspects of normalcy, right? Like you rush to reopen schools, and what's one of the big things the federal government does? What's one of the first things the Biden administration does in reopening schools? And when the sort of new administration took over earlier this spring, it was to double down on testing, right? Our job is actually to, in a moment of crisis, is to pause. Her argument is that a pandemic, a crisis, these cause us to stop for a moment, to pause with business as usual. And rather than rushing to return to normalcy, we should actually use the pause as a portal, as an opportunity, as a gateway, in other words, to imagine a different way forward, right? So questioning common sense allows us to imagine what society could look like, rather than insisting that we return to how some believe it has always looked. Just as a side note, sometimes I like to say that education isn't about preparing us to succeed in the world as it is. Education should actually be about building our capacity to imagine the world as it could be, as it is not yet, and then to build towards that world if we so choose. So, questioning how things have been, imagining a better way forward. These actually can be both exciting and scary. And this then leads to the third lens that I want to point to, which is what I call learning through crisis. Learning through crisis, or like discomfort. So some of you are familiar with the movie The Matrix. It's hard to believe this movie came out in 1999. So some of you may not have been alive when this movie first came out, but even so, you should watch this movie because it is, I think, really interesting in what it offers us related to education. So let me give a quick summary. So the movie The Matrix is released in '99, but it's set several decades in the future. It's several decades later. And in the sort of present, machines have taken over the world. Machines, however, need power. They need energy to run. So what is one of the battery sources for machines? Well, it's the human body. Like if you've seen the movie, you may remember several scenes where there are millions of like pods or large capsules. And in each pod is a human body in a coma. And we are basically the battery sources for these machines. So early in the first movie, the main character, Neo, played by Keanu Reeves, is given the blue pill, red pill choice. Okay? If he takes the blue pill, he'll go back to sleep. He'll go back into the coma and continue thinking that the real world is the 1990s. But if he takes the red pill, he'll wake up and he'll see what the real world is like. Well, there's a Matrix and 2 sequels to the Matrix. So clearly he chose the red pill so that he could lead the humans in the battle against the machines. So what does he learn? When he wakes up, he learns that what he thought was the real world is entirely a computer simulation program. It's entirely a fiction, that the real world is several decades in the future. Most humans are in comas. Those who have escaped the pods are living in hiding. They're being hunted down by the machines. And the climate has been destroyed. They're living underground. I mean, so the reality, the real world is actually something that's far more harsh, far more scary, far more dangerous than what he had imagined, than what he believed up until now. And there's this one scene where he's so upset by what he learns that he stumbles backwards, falls to the ground, and throws up. He like vomits. And I saw that scene and I thought, that scene captures for me one of my favorite theories in education, which I'm calling learning through crisis. So let me explain this theory. There are 4 parts to this theory. One is that learning involves unlearning. Learning involves unlearning. Like learning involves questioning what you thought was the case, right? So conventional wisdom tells us that learning is when I don't know something and I come into a classroom and the teacher gives me new information. It's like a teacher depositing money in a bank account, right? They're giving me something I didn't already have. Okay, that might be what we think learning involves, but in reality, that's not actually what happens. That there's lots of research that tells us that there's actually almost no topic on which a student has no preconceived ideas. Why? Because simply living in the world, we start to develop a sense of how the world works. We develop a sense through our observations and participation of how things work. So when I come to a classroom, I actually need to question what I thought was the case in order to learn something new. Right? If you watch my hands, for example, when really young kids learn addition, they learn that this is addition. So if you ask a kid, a really young child, what is 2 + 2? They might write the answer as 22. You have to get them to unlearn that in order to learn that 2 + 2 is 4. Or if you look across the horizon and it looks like this, why wouldn't I think that the world is flat? I need to unlearn that in order to learn that the world is round. Right? Well, this leads to the second point, is that unlearning can make us uncomfortable, right? Unlearning can lead to discomfort. I like picking up a book and learning I was right the whole time. Like, see, I always thought that was the case, and look, this author says that right here. Like, I don't like picking up a book and learning I was wrong the whole time, right? But according to this theory, that actually is happening all the time. And in fact, there are some methods of teaching that begin with the assumption that there's a lot of things we think we know, but we're actually quite wrong. This is actually a way of teaching that's called beginning with preconceptions. Like, here's an example. You want to teach a unit on gravity. So how do you begin the lesson? You begin by asking students, what have you heard people say about gravity? What do you think you know what is gravity? What do we think we know about gravity? You get students to brainstorm all the things that they've heard people say about gravity. And then the whole lesson is trying to ask questions about whether this is actually true. And you start to learn that the commonsensical idea of gravity is things fall down, right? That's actually not gravity though. Gravity isn't things fall down. So you have to actually learn, well, what actually is gravity? And you start to learn that what conventional wisdom had us believe is only a part of the story, or sometimes is actually quite wrong. Unlearning can make us uncomfortable when we have to question what we thought was the case. The important part of this theory, by the way, is that the more invested I am in what I believe, the more uncomfortable I might be when I have to question it. So I'm a little uncomfortable if I thought the world was flat and now you're telling me the world is round. But what if I believe I got to where I am because I'm smarter and I worked harder than everyone else, and now you're trying to teach me about concepts like privilege, entitlement, and and advantage? Well, that might make me really uncomfortable. And that leads to the third part of this theory, is that discomfort can lead to resistance. The more uncomfortable I am, the more resistant I might be to what it is that I'm learning. What's an example? If I'm in a conversation and you're telling me something that's making me uncomfortable, I don't usually think to myself, wow, that's making me uncomfortable. Like, can you tell me more and make me more uncomfortable? Like, that's not usually my response, right? My response is usually, wow, this is making me uncomfortable. I think I need to stop listening. I need to leave this conversation. And arguably, this is happening all the time. If learning requires unlearning or questioning what you thought was the case, and if unlearning can make us uncomfortable, right, because we realize we were perhaps wrong, why wouldn't we expect that when we're uncomfortable, we might actually not want to learn what it is that we're talking about? Now, this goes against actually so much of not just how we think about education, but how we think about advocacy and activism and outreach, right? Because so much of how we think about education and activism is that you're trying to get people to see things the way I see things, right? You're trying to get people to think the way I think. But does everyone see that according to this theory, the more I try to get you to think the way I think, the more you might actually resist the very things I'm trying to teach. You might be more likely to resist learning. The more I try to teach, the more you might resist learning, right? This is one of the central contradictions of teaching. So this leads to the fourth part of this theory, which is that therefore education must address resistance. We shouldn't try to teach in ways that assume that there's no emotion involved, right? We're actually going to bump up against a wall if we try to teach like that. What we actually have to do is open the doors and create spaces where we can ask uncomfortable questions, especially questions that challenge what I thought was the case. Part of what I'm pointing to, as I just said, are central contradictions in education, these tensions that define what education actually looks like when we engage in it. This then leads to the fourth lens that I want to talk about, which is diving into contradiction, diving into contradiction. A paradox is when two contradictory things coexist. It's when you have two contradictory things at the same time. That's a paradox. So what I would argue is that education is filled with paradoxes. It's filled with all these tensions and contradictions. Let me give you a couple of examples. One is what I call one of the central contradictions of education, the purposes versus the functions of schools, the purpose versus the function. Think for a moment, when we talk about like, what is the purpose of schools? What are the goals? Why do we have schools? What do we often say is the answer? It's things like, oh, it's to provide equal educational opportunity, or it's to prepare everyone to succeed, or it's to level the playing field. Like this is how we often talk about the purposes of education today. But history actually tells us something really quite different. History tells us that the earliest public schools in this country were not at all about equal educational opportunity. Why do I say that? Because the earliest public schools in this country were not for everybody. In fact, only a small group of people could go to our earliest public schools. You had to be a young person who was white, male, and whose family owned property. That's who could attend the earliest public schools in this country. And as we were forced to include more and more groups, girls, people of color, immigrants, and so on, we actually came up with more and more ways to separate them, such as through segregation and through tracking and through labeling and through discipline. We might say today that the purpose of education is equal educational opportunity, but historically we can see that the function has long been to differentiate, to separate, and to sort. We've just come up with different ways of doing that over time, right? And interestingly, just to add even more complexity, when you look at mass schooling systems, like public schooling systems around the world over the last 100 years, as public schooling systems are built up, they were created for very much similar purposes across the different countries. And it's to socialize, it's to teach people how to fit into the societies in which they're born. Now, what's interesting is that at the same time that schools and universities socialize, they also liberate, right? Revolutions that have taken place around the world throughout the 20th century often started where? They often started in universities. Why? Because it's in universities where we are really, one of our major jobs is to question whether things need to look the way they currently look. Right? The purposes and their functions. Schools have multiple purposes. Schools have multiple functions. And what's helpful for us to recognize is that these are often in contradiction to one another. Our job isn't to pretend there isn't that contradiction. Our job is to dive in to the reality that there are all these tensions that define the purposes and functions of schools. Here's another one. Another quick example of like a central contradiction of education has to do with what we teach. I know not all of you are educators, but whether you're an educator or a learner or someone who supports classrooms, here's one thing that I think is interesting to think about when it comes to education. There are two major ways to think about what we teach in schools and in universities. One way to think of it is what we're trying to teach. It's what's often called the formal curriculum. Like if I write up a lesson plan and I'm reading that when I'm teaching my class, that's what I'm trying to teach. That's the formal curriculum. That's often what we think about when we think about teaching. However, there's a whole much bigger category that is called the hidden curriculum, the hidden, the unseen curriculum. And what is the hidden curriculum? It's all the things that I'm teaching that I'm not even aware I'm doing, or that I'm not even intending to teach. So what are some examples? I might make a lesson that says we should be advancing gender equity. Boys and girls should be able to do the same thing. We should treat them the same. Like that might be my formal message in the classroom. But think about all the other ways that gender comes up in schools. Like if I'm in an elementary school, students might notice I'm asking the boys to move the tables, but the girls to sweep. I am teaching about mostly men in history and men in literature. There's mostly male administrators and female teachers. There's boy sports teams. There are more teams for boys and they have the better resources. Even the way we tease each other, like we tell a boy, you throw like a girl, or we tell a girl, you dress like a boy, right? All of these are ways that gender comes up. All of these are ways that teach messages that go against gender equity. So does everyone see, I can have as many formal lessons as I want about gender equity, but if the school is permeated with all these unintended messages about gender equity, that is actually going to be the far more powerful teacher. Right? So our job isn't to pretend that there aren't these hidden messages. Here's another way to think about the hidden curriculum. So someone once came up to me and said, okay, I'm a history teacher. I'm trying to understand what the hidden curriculum is in my class. Do you mean I should be asking things like, whose voices are not in my textbook? And I'm like, yeah, that's exactly what you should be. That's exactly what I'm trying to get at, right? That there are all kinds of ways that go far beyond what I'm trying to teach that actually do still communicate something to students. Our job isn't to pretend that we don't have those contradictions. Our job is to dive into the reality that our education will always be filled with such contradictions. Right? Let me point to one final thing that I want to say about contradiction. One of the major arguments that scholars around the world have made about schools is that one of the central goals of schools is to socialize. It's to prepare students to fit into and succeed in the society as it is. Right? In other words, in many ways, education teaches assimilation. It teaches us to conform to the ways that things are. Now, if that's actually a part of the goal of education, we should ask, what does it mean to be successful in education? We often assume that being successful in education means you are smarter and you worked harder and you did better. But given what I just said about how we've created schools and universities throughout history, you could also argue that those who are the most successful in education aren't necessarily those who are smarter or worked harder. They're actually those who play the game better than everyone else. They're those who can demonstrate success the way that certain people have defined success, right? Our job isn't simply to teach people to succeed in the game as it is. Our job is actually to ask critical questions about whether the game is fair to begin with, right? And I think these point to some of them, some more contradictions within education. So the final thing that I want to talk about, the final or fifth lens, is what I'm calling building movements or building social movements. So when we think about a social movement, civil rights movement, feminist movement, the Occupy movement, the conservative movement, I mean, there are also the labor movement, like all of these immigration rights movements. What defines a social movement? Well, what defines a social movement isn't simply electing people into leadership roles, and it isn't simply changing a law or a policy. What defines a social movement is that a large sector of people have come together and are starting to think differently about society. It's sort of like how I opened up my presentation by saying one of our jobs is to name the moment by telling our own story. A social movement is when a large group of people come together to tell a different story about what's happening in the world, right? And what our intervention needs to be. A social movement, in other words, is reframing the story. It's using different metaphors to tell the story. So part of, I think, what we want to think about here is what does it mean to engage in education in ways that learn from social movements, right? What does it mean for us to engage in education in ways that are far more collective, where we're coming together? What does it mean to engage in education where we're all about questioning conventional wisdom? What does it mean to engage in education in ways that dive into contradiction? What does it mean to engage in education in ways that recognize that social change can be really quite uncomfortable? Let me actually go back to my discomfort argument just to make one more point about that. Why is it so important to think about the role of discomfort in change? Well, it's actually something that many different disciplines have talked about. Some of you study psychology. Well, when the psychologists talk about the stages that we go through when we undergo change, they point out that some of those stages involve being uncomfortable and resisting change. When people study organizational change, one of the things that in the 5 stages of organizational change, what are some of those stages involving? It involves being uncomfortable and resisting change. I talked about curriculum as involving discomfort and resisting change. Social movements are no different. People don't often want significant changes in how the world works, right? They're used to how things are. We're comfortable with how things are. And I think our challenge is to get people to see that things could actually be better, that things aren't perfect the way they are. And that's why it's important to recognize some of these lenses, including the sort of potential of emotions like discomfort and resistance in bringing about better changes, the potential of diving into contradiction, the potential of really understanding the moment on our own terms and figuring out better ways to move forward. So these then are some of the topics, the questions, the opportunities that I have found particularly helpful as I think about when I'm addressing something uncomfortable, when I'm addressing something controversial, when I'm addressing a dilemma. What is it that I can draw on to really help me move forward? And how specifically does education intervene in that work? I hope that these ideas are useful to you as you engage in supporting work moving forward. I cannot wait to see the changes that we make possible as we do so. So let me pause here and see what kinds of questions, and I believe Dr. Shaunut is going to help moderate the discussion, right?
Provoking keynote address. You've provided our audience with much to contemplate while affirming the importance of the role of, or our role as educators. We now invite the audience to ask our speaker questions. Physical audience members may step up to the nearest microphone to ask a question, while our virtual audience members may submit their questions through the Zoom chat. I can start us off with a question that was received earlier, actually, virtually. So we have a question here. How do we expand the ways in which we talk about race and racism? And how do we change our language to talk about multiracial students?
Yeah, how do we expand the ways we talk about race and racism? How do we be more inclusive and expansive around multiracial and mixed race students? You know, I'm super appreciating this question, particularly in this moment when it seems like there's a lot of pressure to speak very narrowly about race and racism and what it means to be of any racialized group. One of the things that I have found particularly helpful for talking about any category as well as any kind of social marker is to think about these identities as themselves very embodying all sorts of diversity, as being very intersectional, for example. You know, like, I think it's problematic to say all people of one race are the same, and you know that there's such commonality that distinguishes one group from another. Just like I think it's really problematic to say that we can talk about race without talking about social class, without talking about gender, without talking about language. Our job is actually to deepen our understanding of what any of these categories means, so that when we talk about difference, when we talk about groups, we can talk about it with a lot of nuance, with a lot of sophistication. And one of the ways I think we do that is by looking intersectionally, like how race intersects with social class and gender. But I think another way we do that is we historicize these concepts. We understand how historically these terms have evolved over time, and how certain social contexts or political or historical contexts shape the ways we think about race or think about identity, right? I'm fascinated, for example, so I identify as Asian American. Asian American has, it means a certain thing in, say, Hawaii, where the majority of people are Asian and Pacific Islander, than say in California, than say in, small town Maine, which is where I lived for like a couple of years. The identities themselves morph over time. And the identities are also not merely cultural. They're not merely about place of origin, right? That these identities are actually shaped by context. We didn't identify as Asian American when we, like 100 years ago in Asia. My ancestors didn't think of themselves as Asian American. This is an identity that emerged only within the last 50 years here in the United States because of what was happening here in the United States. So all of this is to say, our understanding of these identities as very context specific, as very historical products, what we often say is socially, a social product, socially constructed. I think those are really important tools for us to dive in with if we want to actually move forward on the subsequent questions about how we then address racism that often targets only certain groups. Let's complicate our understanding of these issues in order to come up with more sophisticated responses to the problems.
Okay, thank you for that. Anyone have a question in person? You're welcome to step up to the microphone. Okay, let me go to a virtual question, and maybe this will help our audience think of something else. We had a question that says, do you have a story or example of operating from an abundance orientation rather than a politics of scarcity in educational context?
Yeah, I'm appreciating that question. So what I had said earlier is that there's a big tendency of us to buy into the story that we don't have enough resources, scarcity, and so the way we should respond is by cutting spending, austerity, right? Scarcity and austerity is like this really big trend. So what would be an alternative way to respond? So I can't remember if I said this in this presentation or earlier today, but I was talking at some point today about how when the pandemic hit, universities shut down, right? We closed our campuses, schools as well. I mean, everything shut down, restaurants, stores, okay. And one of the things that we did is at the same time that we closed campuses, we actually, as institutions, pretty much all institutions, almost all, did less. We fired a bunch of people. We reduced the number of courses we offered. We reduced the number of social services we offered and health services and other kinds of support services. We did less outreach, less partnerships, and so on. We actually did a lot less. People were housed less, employed less, fed less, and so on. In a moment when unemployment was going up, food insecurity was going up, housing insecurity was going up. So in a moment when the needs, in other words, were greater in society, education actually scaled back. We did less. And part of the reason was because we were all buying into the story that there wasn't enough resources, and the only way that we respond is we cut back. Now, there's a lot of reality to that. The reality is many institutions are driven by tuition and driven by public dollars that were, in both instances, being cut. But what would it mean for us as a society to insist that that not be the repercussion, right? If things were not so driven by the particular models that fund education, wouldn't we have been able to respond differently? So I actually think that part of our challenge is to push an understanding of education as something that isn't locked into particular systems like a market system. Like, right now we think of, so many people think of education as like a commodity. If you have the resources, you should be able to buy the best education, right? It's like shopping for a car. But I think one of our our jobs is actually to reframe that, is to say education shouldn't be thought of as a commodity. Education should be thought of as so fundamental to the health of a democratic society that it needs to be seen as a public good. It needs to be seen as a human right. It needs to be seen as something that is funded from the public sector in an equitable way across for everyone, not just made available to those who can afford a really high quality education. And with that reframing, then comes other things like, what does it mean to adequately fund? What does it mean to boost funding in moments of crisis, and so on? And I think that's how I would maybe urge the reframing, right? With that comes a sense of maybe a little bit of abundance comes with it, because there's so much resources that education has to offer in a moment of crisis, or in a moment just even not of crisis, just in like day-to-day operations of a democracy. But it's even more the case that I think when we see the responsibility that education can play, the intervention that education can play in tackling such difficult social issues, I think that's when we can get a lot more excited about how education needs to be moving forward. Let's reframe the debate. And I think with a powerful reframing, we're going to be able to come up with new ways of imagining how schools and universities can operate in this moment.
Okay, I'll offer the audience. Anyone want to step up to the microphone? Any questions? Okay, we have a question.
Hi, I'm curious. You talked a lot about how this has to do with education and schooling. And I'm curious to know how your approach and idea of lenses and change, how does that move into the work environment? Like, because I'm a college student and I want to see how it goes into my future. How can I apply that in my field?
Great.
Sorry, I was on mute talking to myself. Thank you so much for the question. So these lenses, what does it mean when we take the lenses, not just in educational institutions, but in the workspace and in our work world? So I'm appreciating that question. I'm going to have to think about that a little bit, but off the top of my head, here are some thoughts I have. In any context we find ourselves in, there are certain stories that will dominate, and it'll differ from space to space. But I think this is, you know, with my very first lens, remember I was saying our job is to tell our own story. Well, part of what precedes telling our own story is understanding what are the dominant stories currently in play. And so I think one of the first applications to the work world of everything I just said is one of our first tasks is to try to understand, well, what are the dominant stories in this space? So as I come to my new job, my first task is to understand, well, what are the stories that we all seem to take for granted? What is the common sense in this space? And are those stories the ones that will allow me to flourish, that will allow me to belong and to be included, that will allow me to do the kind of work that I believe I need to do to make the world a better place? So questioning the dominant stories, you know, in many ways, the lenses that I offered are meant to help you question the dominant stories, right? Like contradiction is one of the ways that I try to understand the stories that are circulating in the space that I'm in. In fact, I'm a consultant. I do a lot of research in other institutions, and this is what I focus on. When I collect data and I present it's just like you all, I have to do my homework and then I have to prepare a report for the people who are just like your courses, you do the homework and then you prepare a term paper. So when I'm doing my research, what is the theme that I'm often focusing on? It's things like contradiction. What are the contradictions that are at play here? And how do those contradictions help me to see some of the unspoken commonsensical narratives? So that I think is how some of what comes to mind for me. Use the lenses to surface the dominant stories. Use the lenses to imagine alternative, more just-oriented, more democratic stories. Use even the lenses to anticipate where you're going to encounter problems. You know, when you go into a new workplace, part of the reason you're hired, well, if you have a good boss, part of the reason you're hired is because they assume you'll bring something special, you'll bring something new, you'll bring something brilliant, right? Okay, remember what I just said earlier though, one of the challenges of change is that people don't often really want change. So we often benefit from how things are, right? We're often comfortable with the status quo. So anytime change comes along, that can make us really quite uncomfortable. So the more you can understand the role of discomfort and resistance, the better able you might be in bringing about the kinds of changes that you might have to offer in a new place, right? Again, your job isn't simply to succeed in a space the way everyone else is succeeding. Just like with making the world a better place, our job isn't simply to succeed in the world the way everyone else is succeeding. I think our job is to say, maybe there's a different way to succeed. Like maybe the world could be better than it is right now. And my job is to help us think about how do we get to that place, right? Things are great. There are many great things about the world, but no one, I think, would say the world is perfect. The world can be better. And our job is to build our capacity to imagine. And so the lenses, I think, help us anticipate where we might run into problems, as well as how we might then imagine that better future. Good luck, though, with your studies and your new, wherever direction you go with your work.
Okay, we have another question that you've sort of touched on the response already, but I definitely want to ask the question that was submitted in the chat. How do you approach having conversations about unlearning notions with those who are stubborn in regard to their own lens?
Yeah. You know, this question, how do you work with people who are really stubborn? So many memories of working with stubborn people. Although I'm sure many people might say I'm stubborn too. But so several stories. One of my stories is to say, sometimes the people I think who are hardest to work with are ironically not the people who are blatantly and obviously in disagreement with me. Sometimes the hardest people to work with are people who want to say they're in agreement with me. You know, like there are a lot of people who say racism, that's not a problem in education. Like, let's not even talk about that. Okay, so those are people who obviously disagree with me because I think racism is all over the place. But there are also a lot of people who will agree that racism is a problem, but they think that their understanding of racism is the only way to go, right? They think they're there. They think they've done all their homework, right? And so does everyone see both groups of people are stubborn, and both groups of people, while their perspective is in polar opposites, they will be equally hard to reach because they're not willing to unlearn. Yeah, so I think that what I've done as an educator, in other words, when I'm teaching courses, one of the ways that I try to get folks to be a little bit more open to questioning their ideas is by presenting this theory. In other words, when I was a professor, every first day of every semester, let me try it again. The first day of every semester of a course, I would actually talk about the theory, the lens number 3, learning through crisis. That would be what I talk about on my very first day of a semester. And it's because I'm trying to get people to think about what I think it means to teach and learn. Yeah. And as the semester goes on, and as we run into difficult, uncomfortable moments, I have a framework that I can return to, and I can say, remember we talked about the very first day, like unlearning? Well, are we unlearning something, or are we resisting? Or are we so uncomfortable we can't have the conversation, right? The framework gives us language to use to talk about the process of questioning or resisting. So in classes, I found that to be helpful. And so then as a consultant, I bring that to leadership. And I say, look, as leaders, you're very similar to professors. You're trying to get a group of people to see something a little differently. That's in large part the job of a leader, right? Is you're trying to get people to see that things could be done differently. Things could be done better. We need to assess, right? You're kind of teaching. A leader is kind of like a teacher in some ways, right? So leading in ways that also forefront the theory of change, the theory of learning through crisis, I think gives the leader then language to return to when you hit rough spots. So Having a one-on-one conversation with like a relative, well, that might be much harder, right? How do you say, hey, by the way, I heard this lecture about a theory called learning through crisis, and I think we might be experiencing resistance. Like that, that might be kind of challenging, but I do actually think that having conversations about the process of change helps us to be a little bit more open to change, right? Having a conversation about expecting us to be uncomfortable, expecting us to question preconceived ideas. Like the more you can actually make that explicit and expected and agreed upon, I think the more likely you are to have productive conversations. And my final thought on this is, as much as we might try, the reality is that there are a lot of people we may not be able to nudge, although we might be able to plant a seed, right? This is one of the big misconceptions in education. Like college, I don't know, are you all on semesters? Is that like 15 weeks? What is the assumption? In 15 weeks, you're gonna change how someone thinks? No, 15 weeks is a short period of time. So, but you can plant seeds. And I think that's another thing for us to think about. Yes, people are super stubborn. I'm super stubborn about certain things as well. But our job isn't to transform someone in 15 weeks. Our job is to plant the seeds, to build. Remember, my phrase is not instantly transform. My phrase is build our capacity to do this kind of work. And I think forefronting these theories of changes, informally and formally, are ways that we can work towards that.
Questions? You're welcome to step up to the microphone. Okay, we have another one in the chat. Is there any legitimacy to the idea that morality is relative?
Yeah, is morality relative? So, yeah, I mean, I think that my quick answer is that how we think about right and wrong, good and bad, right, senses of morality, questions of moral questions, absolutely can and have changed over time. They change and they vary. They vary historically, they vary culturally, they vary geographically, they vary ideologically. Now that, and I think sort of the study of history and the study of sort of different cultural groups will tell us that there is this variation. Our question, however, is maybe one step more. This is probably what I'm imagining you're wondering, is not only have we changed our understanding of good and bad, right and wrong over time, but also that we should be doing so, right? So I'm actually, I'm not a firm believer that it's okay for you to have your value system and me to have mine, and I'm just gonna not question yours and not judge yours, right? Because I actually believe that human rights needs to be universally pursued, and that certain cultural systems and moral understandings need to be questioned if they actually reinforce harmful behaviors and actions. So I actually do believe, therefore, that relativity doesn't mean that everyone has the authority to operate their societies within that system with impunity. I actually believe that we need to be holding all across the world, we need to be holding ourselves accountable to constantly assess whether the systems we're operating with, whether that's cultural understandings or legal ones, are enacting harm in ways that we may not have intended, or even in ways that we do. Value systems, moral systems, legal systems should always be seen as partial. So yes, I do think they're relative. I also think they're always partial, however. And that's why I think our job is to intervene. Our job is to constantly insist that things can be better, right? So I do think we need to hold ourselves and other systems to task. I think we need to inquire. I think we need to investigate. I think we need to insist that things can be better. And letting people off the hook just because different systems emerge differently over time and over space, that's a historical fact, is things have emerged differently over time and space. That doesn't mean that we should just back off and say, well, therefore everyone should be able to do what you want to do. We need to become a much more global society that has these kind of cross-boundary, cross-national, cross-cultural conversations with the insistence not that I'm better than you, but that together we will advance, right? One of the tensions with this, like some key tensions around relativity arguments, right? Relativity arguments sometimes says we let everyone do their own thing, and I don't believe that that's a good thing, but I also don't believe in saying that one the opposite, that one system should override another, because that presumes that one system is actually better or has figured everything out. Both systems can be pushing one another. Both systems are partial. Let's not assume that any system escapes the need for that kind of holding accountable, right? That kind of improvement. That's what I would argue. I think that's how I would think about relativity.
Okay, I'll offer the audience again. Does that make you think of any questions? If so, hop on up. Okay, I'll move to another one in the chat. Would you consider the United States to be democratic? And do you think democracy is under attack?
So I think in some ways the United States, I think in many ways the United States is democratic, yeah. However, I think that, let me give a couple of caveats. One is that there are different ways that people define democratic. Right? We understand democracy differently. And I think that is an important conversation for us to have. There isn't just one way of understanding democracy. And my second caveat is that American democracy doesn't equate justice. That American democracy has both good and bad, just and inequitable aspects to it. That is our history. That is fact. That's not an indictment. I'm not saying that therefore the United States is horrible. I'm actually saying there is no country that doesn't have strengths and weaknesses. And the United States and American democracy, the country and the system, are no different. It has strengths and weaknesses. So my answer therefore is quite complicated, right? A, I think there's different ways of understanding democracy. B, I think there's different ways of embodying democracy. And therefore, C, I do think that our trajectory is to constantly work through these tensions, these different understandings and these different embodiments, right? We need to constantly improve on how the United States is trying to embody democracy. And has it done some things well? Of course. And can it be much better? Absolutely. So that's what I would say is my hope for advancing democracy. And just as a side note, when I say that there's different ways of understanding democracy and that the United States has embodied democracy in a particular and partial way, I think it allows us to embrace and sit with several contradictory ideas, right? One, which is that, look historically at how we understand the emergence of modern day kind of Euro-American democracies. There's some interesting recent research that's come out in the last, say, decade that looks historically at the emergence of these democratic nations, and particularly our understanding of democracy as elected democracies, and where that opens up potential for justice and where that falls back. So that's one way to historicize the conversation about democracy. But here's another way to historicize it, that the US embodiment of democracy, how it has animated, I should say, democracy, is inseparable from other aspects of our history. Right? It is inseparable from aspects of our history that are about, say, colonization, that are about empire building, that are about sort of heteropatriarchy, that are about white supremacy. And that isn't, again, it's not to say that we are inherently evil. It's to say there is no country that doesn't have these forces at play in our history. And our job is to try to understand, how do we reckon with that? We haven't gotten rid of it. It's still, the legacy still persists. Our job is to insist that democracy can be animated even better than it is now, right? There are good things, there are bad things, it can be better. And I think that's that's my entrance into this conversation. There's different understandings, there's different ways that it's embodied, and that we can do better. We can do better when we honestly grapple with where we fall short and where our history has brought us. I mean, you can tell like so much of my comments, right, is really about saying, let's be honest with our history. Let's really grapple with how we got here. And I think that's when we more honestly understand who we are today. But I think we also have a more sophisticated mapping of where we might go, right? Let's not buy into simplistic one-sided stories about how we got here or who we are, because that prevents us from moving forward in a productive way.
Okay, thank you. The next question is twofold. It starts off with a statement. The apparent amount of change needed in the U.S. education system can be daunting. What advice do you have for the educator who wants to start making manageable changes now? And through what means do you see more widespread changes being made possible?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Super daunting. I think one of the, a lot of my work tries to say, well, let me backtrack. So I wrote this book about 10 years ago called Bad Teacher: How Blaming Teachers Distorts the Bigger Picture. My book came out right before the movie called Bad Teacher, or maybe it was right after the movie. Some of you may or may not remember the movie called Bad Teacher. And I was like, what timing? My book is about to come out and it has nothing to do with that movie. But anyway, my point was that back then, and now, the way we tend to talk about education is we hyper individualize, right? We say it's all about the individual. And so why are schools failing? We have too many lazy, incompetent teachers. We have parents who don't discipline their children. We have kids who are lazy. We have principals who are incompetent. So we need to hold students accountable. We need to hold teachers accountable. Like, this was the rhetoric, like particularly 10 years ago, although I would argue it's still the rhetoric in large part today. So my book was a response to that hyper individualizing logic. I was trying to argue that when we overly focus on the individual, we lose sight of the much bigger problem, which is the system. So individual, system, we actually need to look at both and not just the individual, right? And blaming individuals distracts from the larger picture. That's the subtitle of the book, right? So I start giving talks of this book. I'm traveling around the country and I'm like, let's look at the system. Let's look at the system. And a common response was, well, now this problem feels so unwieldy. What can I, as a parent or a teacher or a college student or something, what can I do in this context? And so that's when more of my attention began to shift from simply trying to name the problem. Not only was I saying it's a system, I was saying everything is interconnected. Like, you want to address segregation in schools, you have to address segregation in housing. You want to address achievement, you have to address health and mental health. You want to address like teacher pipelines, you have to address access in higher ed. I mean, everything is starting to interconnect. So obviously people are like, what can I as one person do? So more of my attention began to shift at that point to social movements, because I was trying to make the argument that I alone am not going to be able to affect change. And in fact, even if you were to elect me governor, I alone as governor will not be, or president, will not be able to affect change. What makes changes happen is when collectives are coming up, or are acting together, right? So in a way that seems like this is still beyond me, but it begs the question, how do I build the capacity of my community or my profession or my school to act collectively? What's the role that I can play? Well, if you think about a social movement, there are zillions of roles. Everyone's playing a slightly different role. Some people are the leader. They're leading the march. They're giving the public talks. Some people are the media people. Some people are the teachers, and some people are the artists. Everyone has their role in sort of building towards and building up a social movement. And in fact, I even like to say that even if you're not a teacher in front of a classroom, which is super important, you can still be teaching, right? Some of the most important conversations that organizers will tell you need to happen are with your neighbors, with your coworkers, and with your family members. Sometimes, am I right? Sometimes they're some of the hardest people to talk to. It's much easier for me to stand in front of a room where I can't see anyone's expressions and say all the things I think, rather than talk to, say, I don't know, my mother. That can be much more challenging about the things I'm talking about here. But Isn't it, am I right, those of you who do community organizing, that it's those kinds of conversations that are incredibly important? Okay, so what's my point? I don't think there is one way, one role for any individual, the same role for all individuals to play in building movements. Our job is to understand that change happens through processes as embodied in social movements. So if you're to look at social movements, what you'll see is that there's a lot of roles for us to play. Our job is to figure out, well, what's the skills or the value that I bring to the struggle, and how can I engage in that? Let me give 3 quick examples. 1, talk to people. But here's another one. Particularly, am I right that the question was from an educator? What can educators do? Yeah, for the educator. So educators are not only in the classroom. What I love is when people think about educators as much more engaged in the public space. What would it mean for educators to speak collectively through the media? What would it mean for educators to speak collectively to decision makers? I actually think this is a really powerful thing we want to explore far more. Speaking collectively in a much more public facing way. Doing what we do best, teaching, asking critical questions, raising consciousness, but with a slightly different audience, not simply the students in our classroom, but with the public outside. So that kind of collective public-facing work, in addition to speaking one-on-one to people, I think are 2 things that I would say. And then a third thing, just to kind of hammer home that movement building gives us lots of roles, is to imagine what are the other skill sets that we bring that can make an intervention in this moment. Remember that I said that yes, we want to change policies. We want to change curriculum. We want to change who's in the elected leaders. But we also want to shift the public consciousness, because that's when really big changes are going to snowball. So a lot of educators have these hidden skill sets sometimes that I'm always so impressed when I understand or come to learn about people who are really good at media work, really good at arts, really good at organizing, really good at, something at writing, blogging, or investigative journalism, and then they put it up in their blog or whatever. I think that's, without saying that teachers need to take on everything, which is absolutely not what I'm saying. I'm saying, let's imagine our work as exceeding what happens in the classroom, but that draws on everything we're so good at in the classroom, right? Let's be pedagogical in these other spaces and see whether we can contribute to movement building and capacity building for social movements. I think those are some of the initial thoughts I have. Educators, okay, last thought. I think that one of the things that's really challenging is this is a really difficult moment for educators. Like, educators are so under attack, and there's a wave of legislation happening around the country that's actually going to make educators even more under attack, even more surveyed, even more documented, reported on, harassed on social media, profiled on web pages. I mean, because of all the sort of things going on around curriculum in the legislatures. So even more, we need to insist that the work of education not be so siloed, not be so hyper-individualized. If I were still in the classroom, I think one of the things I would do far more than I did before was try to make sure I'm building up my collective, that I was finding my community of like-minded folks, my professional community, in other words, so that the work isn't so isolating, so that I'm not so alone. Yeah.
One last question, I think, unless, of course, we have another from the audience. Can you tell us about a time that you yourself have been involved in a difficult ethical decision?
Involved in a difficult ethical decision. I feel like this is the kind of question you get when you're like interviewing to be a principal. Or maybe I got the question when I was interviewing to be a dean, and then I just like, I don't know. That's a good question. Okay, I'm not going to deflect, but one of the things I used to do when I was interviewing for a job and like I would get a really difficult question, I would say something like, oh, no, it wasn't when I was interviewing for a job. It was like this, when I was giving a lecture, and sometimes people would ask me a question. I would say, that is such a good question. What do some of you in this room think would be a good answer? Okay, you can't do that in a job interview, and I won't do that here since I can't see you all face to face. All right, so I'll try to answer your question. An ethical dilemma. So, the examples that are coming to mind have to do with this tension around democratic decision-making and confidentiality or privacy. So as an administrator, because I was a dean, and before that I directed like an institute, I directed a grant, I chaired a program. So in all of these roles, there are certain things we do around personnel that are like hiring, firing, disciplining, things like that, that are confidential, that can't be shared with everyone. And a lot of people do understand that, I think, that there's a lot of things you cannot say. And there's a lot of things that person will say that might be misrepresenting, but then I can't clarify because everything is supposed to be confidential. Where I think that was particularly challenging for me was when it was related to another topic that was supposed to be decided on collectively. Like, let's say we were to try to launch an initiative, a project, and I won't name the project because it might give away who I'm talking about. But let's say we're trying to launch a project and there was a person who was supposed to play a pivotal role. The project was supposed to be decided on collectively, because this was my big theme as a dean. I was all about the collective decision-making and shared governance and I was all about using those kinds of terms. And so I wanted people to be involved in the deliberations and the final decision. But a key player was no longer part of that project because of a decision I made that was a confidential decision. So people were very upset on a number of reasons. Like, one, while they understood that there are certain things that I couldn't describe, they were saying, you've just, however, affected our ability to engage in collective decision-making when one of the key players is no longer here. Like, why did this have to happen now? The timing is bad, the project timeline is thrown off, and so on. But there was also something about tone, like the way that this all got communicated with everyone almost betrayed this commitment to shared governance and transparency and communication. So for me, it was kind of like a learning process that democratic decision-making isn't about majority vote. Democratic decision-making isn't about consensus. Democratic decision-making to me is about being transparent as I can about which process we're going to follow in any given context, right? Because to me, I was trying to say, look, our college can be governed in a very democratic way, even though there are certain decisions that none of you will contribute to or even be informed about. That doesn't mean we're not democratic, but it can absolutely work against democracy and community building if I'm never clear when we're going to actually vote versus when I'm going to make a kind of a top-down decision. Does everyone see that it's not then about always having majority vote and consensus? To me, the commitment was around transparency about process. In this instance, we use this process. In this instance, we use this process. Make that clear, make it super consistent, make it protected. And then I felt like that actually was a far more democratic decision-making process. So, I mean, I don't know if this counts as an ethical dilemma, but I mean, one of the things that it does do is it raised for me these larger questions about what does it mean to engage in democracy? What does it mean to kind of allow different people to share in decision-making? What does it mean for me to protect confidentiality? What does it mean for me to act in the best interest of the institution and to act in the best interest of individuals? Ethical dilemmas sometimes don't have like an easy answer because they're pulling us against or across these important tensions, right? And our job is to kind of dive into those tensions and to surface them rather than to think that we can wish away the complexity in order to come up with the best decision. So that was a learning for me. I mean, I don't think I always made great decisions after that either, but I did start to say thereafter that for me, this is how I think about decision-making. And my job is to be as transparent as I can about process, even if I can't always guarantee everyone to have input, and even if I can't even guarantee transparency about the background to the decision at every moment.
Okay, well, thank you so much to the audience for your excellent questions. And thank you again to Dr. Kumashiro for such a thought-provoking keynote address. I will now turn it over to Dr. McCoy for the closing remarks and adjournment.
And if you would, let's give a round of applause to our great MC for today, for tonight, Dr. Shelnut. So we're so happy, and I'm really happy that we had an opportunity to experience the knowledge and the vast amount of experience in education by Dr. Kumashiro. I just wanted to say a couple of things. First of all, thank you so much to the College of Education and their leadership team, especially Dean Peterson, for really promoting this event on this year. I shared with them earlier that we change colleges every year, and this year was College of Education. And I really think they could not, they chose the speaker, and I don't think they could have possibly chosen a better speaker. So thank you to the College of Education leadership team. I also want to acknowledge all of the people that are joining us virtually. Many are directly from Clemson, but many are not directly attached to Clemson. And so we thank the community members who supported this program. I can't do my job without Rachel Dial, who is the assistant director. I almost said superintendent. Assistant director who keeps me in line and keeps me focused on a lot of things. And then when things that I don't know how to do, that she does is just absolutely phenomenal. So thank you so much, Rachel, for being one of the best assistant directors one could ever have. And also, again, thank you, Dr. Kumashiro, for an excellent, just absolutely excellent presentation on today. I wanted to just let you know about a few things. We have a Distinguished Ethics Scholars Program, and I would invite all of you to please check out our Distinguished Ethics Scholars Program. It is an opportunity to be awarded based on attending programs, either a cord at graduation or a medallion upon graduation from Clemson. Just a couple things you would have to do programmatically to fulfill that. So I want to encourage you to look at that. Also, we have a video ethics competition that we do every year. And for those of you that are gifted and like to put together videos, we certainly have that competition. I think we give out 3 prizes. I was trying to think what the amounts were. I think it's $1,500 and $250, I think, in that order. So you can, first place is $1,000, second place is $500, third place is $250. And so if you put together, again, all this information is on our website and it's open to any student here. Many of you are gifted and like to put together things like that. So I would encourage you to take a look at that. We have 2 awards that we offer. For those of you that feel that you have done something in your career, in your job, in your part as a student that would warrant you being distinguished as a person of ethical leadership, who has displayed ethical leadership or ethical decision-making, I would encourage you to look at the Cherry Broswell Rutland Award. There's only one award, but it is at $1,000. And so you pretty much write an essay. Again, it's on our website. Write an essay and let us know what you've done to demonstrate ethical leadership and or ethical decision-making. We have a panel of people that look at it. One award is given $4,000. Also, we have the J.T. Barton Jr. Award. This is a repurposed award this is extremely important for you to know. Many of you are a part of an organization, whether it's a fraternity or a sorority or another group on campus. And what we do is give groups 3 opportunities, or give 3 opportunities for a group or an individual that does programming that anywhere in the program promotes ethical decision-making and or ethical leadership. Anywhere in that program that you do that, you can apply, and we have a panel of people to look at it. We have a $1,500 award, a $1,000 award, and a $500 award. This can be open to any sorority, any fraternity, any student group on this campus. And if you just by yourself want to do a program, we can even do it individually. We don't guarantee that everyone will win, but I can tell you this, we don't have enough people in the past who have applied. So I'm just telling you, your chances are good unless we get an overflow of people, and we really do want to give the money away legitimately, okay? So please take a look at the J.T. Barton Jr. Award with those 3 prizes for first, second, and third, $1,500, $1,000, and $500. And then lastly, in the spring, be on the lookout for the Clemson Tide Conference. The Clemson Tide Conference. TIDE stands for Tigers for Inclusion, Diversity, and Ethics. We will be holding that probably toward the end of March, and it'll be probably a combination, in some cases of in-person, in some cases virtually. But we will put that information out. Please be on the lookout for the TIDE Conference, where we'll have other great speakers like Dr. Kumashiro. But the unique thing about it is every college has their own speaker. Every college chooses their own speaker. And then we wrap the conference up with a keynote speaker, such as Dr. Kumashiro. So we're working as a faculty to figure out how that's going to look this year, but probably around January or February, we will start advertising. So I want to encourage you to look at our website. We're trying to give away money. We can't give it away if you don't ever apply. And I want you to be as successful and as creative as you can possibly be. Thank you so much for being with us in our 2021 Annual Ethics Day celebration. Have a wonderful day. I look forward to seeing you soon.